Intel and AMD. The rivalry has been going on for quite a while now, but really, is there any difference between these two different CPUs, and what's the difference if there is any? So, starting off with Intel. Now, if you look at an Intel processor compared to an AMD processor, you might not notice a lot until you look at the back. Now, AMD processors usually, especially their consumer processors, usually use a type of PGA, which stands for pin grid array, and all that really means is that the pins are located on the CPU instead of inside of the CPU socket. Now, Intel CPUs differ a little bit because they use what's called LGA, and that means that the pads are actually on the CPU itself instead of in the socket, which means that the socket has pins that stick up instead of pads. Now, the big difference between them is that in order to not bend any of the pins, you have to be more careful with the motherboards with Intel and more careful with the processors on AMD. Now, for a lot of people, that really doesn't make a difference, but specifically for some people, especially me, that makes a little bit of a difference because I'm kind of a klutz, to be honest. The next point of comparison usually is architecture. Now, comparing the architecture between Intel chips and AMD chips is actually pretty difficult. Up until the late 2000s, when multi-core processing became a big thing, Intel and AMD were actually pretty similar because they both offered excellent single-core processors. But once the Core 2 Duo hit and other Phenom stuff hit from AMD and the i3, the i5, and i7 finally came out, Intel started taking a massive lead. AMD chips usually feature a higher core count now instead of Intel chips. For example, a couple Ryzen 5 chips actually have 6 cores, whereas Intel chips usually have 4 cores or 2 cores with hyperthreading. So what does that mean for Intel? So Intel chips usually are focused and are better for gaming. Now the Intel i7 line is actually really good for productivity, usually because it features about 4 to 6 cores. But the Intel i5 chips and i3 chips are actually excellent gaming chips. On the other hand, AMD chips are usually more focused on productivity and have less of an emphasis on gaming. AMD processors usually have a much faster multi-threaded speed than Intel chips, and that's simply because of the architecture inside of AMD chips. So the secret sauce to AMD chips and why they're able to fit so many CPU cores onto a die is because they use what's called clustering. So all clustering really is they take multiple cores and just stick them together, and then they stick multiple of those clusters together. Intel did something similar back with the Pentium D, which was the first dual-core processor from Intel, and all they did is they stuck 2 single-core chips together and called it a dual-core processor. AMD does something a little bit similar, but they usually do it with dual or quad-core processors. This stuff is actually seen in the Xbox One and PS4, which both use quad-core Jaguar clusters, and they just stick them together to get an 8-core processor. Intel chips, on the other hand, don't use clustering. What they do is they take different CPU cores and they just stick them together. AMD is now using something that they call the Infinity Fabric in their Ryzen chips, and all that really does is it just allows the cores to communicate much faster. So, what does this really mean? Well, in short, AMD CPUs usually have a much better price, and you usually can get much higher performance for the same price. What Intel chips offer is they offer much better overall performance. What you get from an AMD chip usually is what you'd get from an Intel chip, except for half the price. The thing is that AMD chips usually aren't exactly up to spec as Intel chips. An AMD quad-core usually performs much worse than an Intel quad-core. Now, why is this? It's because of the differences that I explained in the architecture. Overall, which one should you get? Well, honestly, you shouldn't go with a company. What you should do is you should do research on both CPUs and decide what you want to do with them. If you're more minded on productivity, choose the one that's more minded for productivity. But if you're more focused on gaming and content creation, I would focus on the CPU that is much better suited for that. Overall, AMD and Intel produce excellent central processing units. But what does that mean for the consumer? It means that you are getting excellent competition at excellent prices. So, overall, it's really personal preference over which one you want. So thank you all so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to click here for more videos. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest tech news, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.